In the Avengers movies and other Marvel Cinematic Universe movies in which the Avengers interact, we often see a conflict between worldviews. In the Avengers, Captain America and Iron Man are at odds with each other. In Avengers Age of Ultron, Captain America and Iron Man are at odds with each other. And in Captain America Civil War, Captain America and Iron Man are at odds with each other. Why was Tony Stark so surprised and hurt that Steve turned on him and sided with Bucky? They were obviously not friends. But anyway, these conflicts were often about big, important stuff, namely ethics. In philosophy, the branch of ethics is concerned with questions of how people should act and the search for the definition of correct conduct. It involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of behavior. Philosophers today usually divide ethical theories into three general subject areas: metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. Today we will look at normative ethics and how various Avengers operate under different normative ethical theories. I promised in a previous video that I would expand on this, and here we are. Normative ethics is the study of an ethical action. A normative ethical theory is a system that serves to articulate and advocate an ethical code or to provide justifiable and reliable principles to determine what is moral behavior. All normative ethical theories share structural characteristics, meaning that a normative ethical theory comprises a moral standard, general moral principles, and specific judgments. The idea behind a normative ethics theory is that it contains a rock-solid moral standard which creates moral principles, which are then evidence for moral judgments. Example: the moral standard of role ethics, which we will not be covering much today, is respect for family and community is paramount. General moral principles to come from this include sons have duties to their parents and vice versa. A specific moral judgment is a son who disrespects his father is doing something immoral, or a son seeking justice for his father is doing something moral. Tony Stark goes through these two examples that would lead to specific moral judgments throughout the course of Captain America Civil War, but role ethics is kind of its own thing. The vast majority of normative ethical theories can be divided into these three categories: deontological, virtue, and consequentialist. Let's start with the first. A normative ethical theory that is deontological focuses on moral obligations and duties rather than on an action's ends or consequences, the act itself. These are duties that one must observe and represent actions that are either moral or immoral in and of themselves. That is why deontological ethical theory is sometimes called duty theory instead.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
So, with great power comes great responsibility. Spider-Man, a relatively recent addition to the Avengers, believes that he has no choice in his actions. His place in the world demands that he follow a strict code related to what he can and cannot do, but also what he ought to do. 17th century German philosopher Samuel Pufendorf helped popularize duty as a goal in and of itself, but since he couched his normative ethical theory in the religious, and the Avengers movies are largely secular, except for Thor, I guess, maybe Spider-Man's normative ethical theory has its basis more in the work of 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. See, Kant believed that different religions will always give different answers to what is right, so he concluded that what is right must instead be a kind of mathematical constant. He believed in categorical imperatives, rules you must follow at all times regardless of the desires of the individual. This moral law is binding in all of us. So when Spider-Man often remarks, "with great power comes great responsibility," he does not only mean that for himself because he happened to have been bitten by a radioactive spider. No, he actually means that we must all be responsible under this strict code. To Kant, and perhaps to Spider-Man, we must only act to that rule that which we can at the same time assert that it should become universal law. I'm paraphrasing him here, but in short, it means that if we do something to discover if it is moral, we have to conclude that it should be done as general, universal conduct, not just for ourselves and in this one instance. Let's say Spider-Man desperately needs money to pay for his high-tech gadgets, and he knows that with his powers he would be able to steal a little bit of extra cash. One could reason that with a little stolen money he could do far more good as a superhero, but as a deontological normative ethical theorist with a very firm categorical imperative, Spider-Man must not do this because he could not rationalize everyone deciding to steal from others even if they claimed that they would do something good with the money. Under Kantian ethics, if Spider-Man steals, he is universalizing theft. Meaning if Spider-Man can steal, everyone can steal, irrespective of motive. Kant believed that we can't make exceptions for ourselves. Consequences do not come into the equation. The action itself is right or wrong. When Spider-Man stops the bank robbers, it does not concern him why this is happening. They might be stealing to feed their starving families for all he knows, but that does not matter because the action of stealing itself is wrong to Spider-Man, regardless of motive or consequence, and these men must be stopped. The drawback to following a deontological normative ethical theory like this is that it can lead to disaster. The classic argument against this normative ethical theory usually comes in the form of the inability to commit small acts that under most circumstances would be wrong, but not under dire circumstances. Example: the Vulture interrogates Spider-Man about the identity of Peter Parker. Spider-Man knows that lying is wrong. In a sense, when interrogated, is he under a moral obligation under his normative ethical theory to disclose the truth about his secret identity? What about his obligation toward protecting his loved ones, like Aunt May? Without his secret identity intact, she could be in danger. Kant would argue against lying, no matter what. He would say that if Spider-Man tells the truth, he could still warn his loved ones, and even if his loved ones are put in danger later, that is the result of the Vulture's actions. However, if he lies, and through this lie, the Vulture becomes angry and determined and discovers Spider-Man's identity because of this, Spider-Man would be responsible for putting his loved ones in danger due to his lie. Moral standard: do only that which can be universal. Moral principle: lying is wrong. Moral judgment: Peter Parker lying to the Vulture is wrong. What Kant does not say is that all of this requires a few leaps in logic and suppositions about what might occur. Frankly, this reasoning seems convoluted, but in this ethical theory, consequences are irrelevant. Action is everything. A deontological normative ethical theory is extremely black and white and does not take context or extenuating circumstances into account. An example of following this ethical theory is seen in Captain America: Civil War, in which Spider-Man joins Iron Man's side in the conflict without understanding the nuances of what is happening. Spider-Man probably believes he doesn't need to. What Captain America is doing is illegal and broadly condemned by society, and Spider-Man, knowing little of the intricacies, fights Captain America. It doesn't matter why Cap is doing what he is doing, his end goals, or the consequences of this conflict. All Spider-Man, as a deontological normative ethical theorist, needs to know is Cap is wrong and therefore must be stopped, and be stopped by men like Spider-Man because of his categorical imperative about power and responsibility. So a deontological normative ethical theory sounds good and fair and righteous, but it can lead to some dangerous situations for all involved. Now, as you might have guessed, not everyone is Spider-Man. Not everyone can do what a spider can, and not everyone subscribes to this normative ethical theory. Next, we have a far older theory called virtue ethics. This normative ethical theory states that rightness is achieved by developing good habits of character. Ancient philosopher Plato defined virtue ethics through these four cardinal characteristics: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. These four defining characteristics might remind you of someone in the Avengers movies: Captain America. Steve Rogers is put on a pedestal because he embodies these four qualities, and in developing these qualities and showcasing them to others, people are inspired to live in a similar manner and develop these qualities in themselves. Wisdom, sometimes translated as prudence instead. Captain America is shown leading both the Avengers and instructing the New York Police Department on how best to solve the alien crisis. Courage, sometimes translated as fortitude. Captain America jumps on a grenade he believes is live, long before he even has the super soldier serum running through his veins. Temperance. Captain America is generally self-restrained and does not lose his temper. He also expects this of others.
Shit! Language!
And finally, justice. Well, this goes without saying, doesn't it? Captain America dedicates his life to it. Plato references other virtues as well, but Captain America lives up to the 4 cardinal virtues almost perfectly. There are some noticeable drawbacks to virtue being an entire theory of normative ethics, though. One major problem with this theory is the difficulty of establishing virtues when different people, cultures, and societies have wildly different opinions on what is and is not a virtue. For example, one might think of faith as a virtue and others might scoff. Someone might call physical fortitude a cardinal virtue, whereas others might consider it a lesser quality. Another objection is that this theory does not guide action or focus on what sorts of actions are morally acceptable, only what sorts of qualities someone should have in the first place. Because of this, moral judgments can be challenging under this normative ethical theory. Yet another problem is that virtue ethics appears, at least superficially, self-centered, whereas morality is meant to be about how our actions affect other people. This might explain Iron Man's skepticism and incredulity about Captain America's Boy Scout routine. It is difficult to imagine someone whose primary goals in life are all related to maintaining these virtues, especially for someone like Tony, who has, in the past, been so committed to vice. Captain America may be portrayed as a paragon of virtue, but such a man is incredibly rare, even impossible. Finally, let's look at the teleological theory of normative ethics, or consequentialist. As the name suggests, a consequentialist theory argues that an action's consequences determine what is and is not good. That means good consequences equal good actions, regardless of motives or the virtuousness of the actor. A subset of consequentialist normative ethics is called utilitarianism, which is the belief that society should attempt to maximize good. The morally right action is always the one that produces the most good, not only for the individual and in this one instance, but for all society. Example: Iron Man invades sovereign nations in an extrajudicial, personal war against men who we can only assume are bad guys. His actions are definitely illegal. There are airspace laws and border laws that he has no doubt violated. Also, based on the power of his weaponry and all these explosions, one might find it difficult to assert that all of these men lived through this encounter. In other words, Iron Man kills people. In the MCU, we don't see it happen as graphically or in close-up as in other superhero movies, but men have definitely died due to the actions of Iron Man. In fact, a lot of MCU superheroes kill people, but let's stick to our one example or we will be here all day. While these actions are certainly questionable, Iron Man likely believes that his actions are for the greater good. Utilitarian consequentialists believe that goodness can be quantified and calculated so that we can always know the morally correct course of action. And as a genius and scientist, a consequentialist normative ethical theory probably makes the most sense. A net positive in goodness in the world. A calculation of goodness even though he did not follow the strict moral outlines of someone like Kant or even Spider-Man. Those who follow consequentialist and more specifically utilitarian ethics must answer the charge that ends do not justify the means. The problem with Iron Man's normative ethical theory is that it tends to separate the achieved ends from the action by which these ends were produced. Also, even though Iron Man is a genius, he cannot foresee all consequences of his actions. He did not foresee the rise of Ultron, even though his technology was related to it. He can try to curtail as much bad as possible, such as when he opts to leave the arms dealing business, but that does not solve everything. There are too many variables. People who oppose this normative ethical theory argue that if we follow deontological ethics or virtue ethics instead, at least we would always be trying to do the right thing, whereas consequentialists could always be going out of their way to do wrongs in hopes of attaining a greater goodness that they cannot fully predict. The mere existence of his incredibly powerful technology is enough for other people and other nations to attempt to replicate it. Let's look at a couple other examples related to Iron Man. He believed that using artificial intelligence would lead to optimizing happiness and safety for society, but he ignores the other Avengers and develops this technology in secret. Even after a disastrous creation of an artificially intelligent being, Iron Man and the Hulk decide to create another. Captain America believes the consequences of this action are too dangerous and too risky based on past evidence, whereas Iron Man believes the risk is clearly worth it. The calculation of the greatest good for society is subject to the person working that equation. Tony Stark thinks very highly of himself. I mean, obviously. And this narcissism allows for him to believe he is the right person to make these utilitarian calculations and decisions. Are all these deaths truly for the greater good of society? And perhaps more importantly, why does Iron Man, of all people, get to be the one human being who can make this moral judgment? See, utilitarian ethics insist that rather than judging from one's own perspective, we should judge from the perspective of an unrelated stranger. That way, the moral judgment would come from a place of objectivity, but that is more of a trick than a practice because a human being can never truly escape the subjectivity of their own bias and prejudice. Iron Man, smart as he may be, is still an Iron Man, and not deity. Later on, he works with the world governments to help further the Sokovia Accords. Under this law, the Avengers would have greater oversight, but also could potentially put them at the mercy of others who give them orders to do things that they would find morally suspect. That was Captain America's objection. Iron Man believes that while this may create some problems for the world and for the superheroes, it still maximizes utility based on their available legal options. Greater good ethics in government can lead to questionable justifications, like enslaving a minority in hopes of making the majority happier and safer. It can ignore justice itself. The key assumption in normative ethics is that there is only one ultimate criterion of moral conduct, whether it is a single rule or a set of principles. As with a scientific theory, a normative ethical theory must be consistent, or else it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. But all normative ethical theories have a lot of holes that cannot be filled, leading some to speculate that there can't be any standards of ethics. But it is better to own a flawed textbook than to give up on the study completely. Humans, super or otherwise, are doing their best with what they have. Hopefully, we'll all figure it out eventually. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.